He hadn't taken a single step in 3 years, not because he couldn't, because some broken part of him had decided he didn't deserve to. My name doesn't matter yet, you'll know it soon enough, but the man in this story is Nathaniel Cole, 36 years old, owner of a logistics empire that stretched across 4 states. A house with more rooms than he'd ever bothered to count, and a wheelchair that had never once been medically necessary. Nobody knew that last part, not his doctors, not his board of directors. Not even his mother, who'd stopped visiting 2 years earlier because, in her words, the house had started to feel like a mausoleum with good lighting. The truth was almost too strange to say out loud. Nathaniel's legs worked fine, they always had. But on a wet October night 3 years back, he'd made a decision, not consciously, not really a decision at all in the way we usually mean that word, and since that night, he simply hadn't stood up. It started with the crash. His wife Sarah and their unborn daughter had died in it. Nathaniel had been behind the wheel. He walked away with a hairline fracture in his wrist, and a guilt so heavy it seemed to physically press down on him, day after day until some deep, wounded corner of his mind quietly shut the door on his own legs. A doctor might have called it a conversion disorder, the mind convincing the body to stop, as a kind of penance nobody asked it to pay. Nathaniel never bothered learning the clinical term. He only knew that when he tried to stand, something in him simply refused. And when a specialist finally told him, gently, privately, that there was nothing wrong with his spine, nothing wrong with the nerves running down his legs, Nathaniel made a real choice for the first time since the funeral. He decided to stay seated anyway. It was easier. People don't expect much from a man in a wheelchair. Nobody asks him to rebuild a life. Nobody expects him to smile or date again or want anything. The chair had become armor. Behind it, he could disappear from a world he no longer trusted himself in. His longtime housekeeper had retired that spring, and the agency sent over a replacement, a quiet, careful woman named Rosa Delgado, 30 years old, with the kind of tired eyes that still somehow held warmth in them. She needed the job badly. Her ex-husband had left not long after their daughter was born, and daycare ate more of her paycheck than she liked to admit out loud. So on her very first morning, she worked up the courage to ask Nathaniel's assistant a question that made her stomach twist with nerves. "Would it be all right if I brought my little girl with me sometimes? She's quiet, she won't cause any trouble, I promise." The assistant almost said no automatically. Mr. Cole didn't like surprises. He barely spoke to staff beyond what was strictly necessary. But something about the desperation behind Rose's polite request made him pause, and he told her okay just this once and hoped for the best. That's how on a gray Tuesday in early spring, a 3-year-old named Maya walked into the coldest, quietest house she'd ever seen in her life, one small hand wrapped around her mother's, the other clutching a stuffed elephant with a chewed ear and a missing button eye. Nathaniel was in his study when he heard its small feet against marble, and then a burst of laughter so sudden, so bright, that for a second he genuinely didn't recognize the sound. The house hadn't heard laughter like that in 3 years. He wheeled himself to the doorway, already annoyed, already rehearsing the sentence where he'd remind Rosa that children weren't part of their arrangement, and then he saw her. Maya was spinning slow circles in the middle of the foyer, head tipped all the way back, staring up at the chandelier like it held actual stars. Dark curls bounced with every turn. Yellow dress with a juice stain on the front, one sock pink, the other covered in tiny cartoon planets. Mama, look. It's like the house has stars inside it. Rosa came rushing around the corner, scooping her daughter up mid-spin, already apologizing before she'd even reached the study door. "I'm so sorry, sir. She's never seen a house this big. I'll keep her in the kitchen, I swear." Nathaniel opened his mouth to say something sharp. What came out instead surprised him more than it surprised her. "It's fine. Let her look." Rosa blinked, certain she'd misheard, but nodded anyway, murmured a thank you, and carried her daughter off toward the kitchen. Nathaniel sat there a long moment, still watching the empty spot in the foyer where a little girl had just been convinced the ceiling was full of stars. That night, alone in a bed built for two, he found himself thinking about the way she'd looked up. Not at anything special, just an ordinary chandelier, and yet she'd found something worth spinning for. For the first time in 3 years, he fell asleep without the familiar iron weight of grief sitting on his chest. He didn't know it yet, but something frozen in him had just started quietly to thaw. Here's the part nobody in that house expected, not Rosa, not Nathaniel, and definitely not the doctors who'd already written him off as a permanent case. Because Maya wasn't done finding her way back to that study, not by a long shot. Rosa tried to keep her daughter contained, kitchen, staff, sitting room, anywhere far from Mr. Cole's private wing. But 3-year-olds don't respect boundaries they can't see, and Maya had a talent for finding the most interesting corner of any room within about 90 seconds. She found the library with its rolling ladder that stretched to the ceiling. She found the garden with its stone fountain shaped like a heron. And more than once, she found her way back to the study, where a quiet man in a wheelchair sat behind a desk, staring at paperwork he wasn't actually reading. The first few times, Nathaniel sent her back gently but firmly. He wasn't ready for this, for warmth, for noise, for anything small and bright pushing its way into the careful, cold order he'd built. But Maya had the patience only small children have, the kind that doesn't understand grief or walls or why a grown man might want to be left alone. She just understood that the sad man in the chair seemed lonely, and in her world, lonely people needed a friend, so she kept coming back. By the second week, she'd stopped asking. She'd drag a little ottoman over to his desk, plant herself down with a coloring book, and hum some tuneless little song while he pretended to work. He tolerated it at first because objecting felt like more effort than it was worth. Then, without quite noticing the shift, he started listening for the humming. It filled the study in a way that didn't feel like intrusion anymore. It felt like company. One afternoon she held up a drawing, all confident crayon scribbles. "This is you," she announced, pointing at a purple stick figure with an enormous lopsided smile. "I don't smile like that." "You will," she said like it was just a fact of the universe and went back to coloring. He stared at her a second too long. Something about her certainty unsettled him, not unpleasantly. Rosa, meanwhile, was living in quiet dread. Every day she braced for the assistant to pull her aside and end the arrangement. Every day it didn't happen. She started noticing small things instead. The house felt different when Maya was in it. Once she could have sworn she heard Mr. Cole laugh, a short, startled sound quickly swallowed, drifting out of the study. She didn't let herself hope it meant anything. Rich men were unpredictable, and hope was a luxury she couldn't afford to lose her job over. But Maya had already decided Nathaniel was her friend, and in a 3-year-old's world, friendship comes with obligations. She brought him her favorite crackers at snack time, always insisting he take the better half. She brought him a new drawing almost daily, the purple stick figure's smile getting a little wider each time. She told him long, wandering stories about her elephant, whose name was apparently Sir Buttons, and who had somehow gotten into several adventures involving a dragon and, for reasons she never explained, a sandwich that could talk. Nathaniel found himself actually answering her, not the flat, distant replies he gave board members and doctors, real answers. He asked follow-up questions about the dragon. He told her the purple stick figure's smile was looking very convincing today. Something buried under 3 years of numbness started, cautiously, to stir. And that's the moment everything almost fell apart, because what Maya asked him next wasn't something a 3-year-old was supposed to know how to ask at all. One rainy afternoon, Rosa came to collect her daughter and found Maya standing beside the wheelchair, one small hand resting on Nathaniel's arm, looking up at him with the kind of serious, searching eyes only kids seem to manage. "Are you sad because your legs don't work?" The room went still. Rosa froze in the doorway, already halfway into an apology. Nathaniel looked down at the little girl's open, guileless face and felt something twist hard in his chest. He'd spent 3 years perfecting a careful sadness for adults who tiptoed politely around his condition, who never once asked him a straight question. Nobody had simply asked him plainly, directly, if that was the reason. "I'm sad about something else," he said quietly. It was, in its own strange way, the most honest sentence he'd spoken out loud in 3 years. Maya considered this with the gravity of a tiny philosopher. Then, without asking permission, she climbed into his lap and tucked herself against his chest, the way children do when they've decided, instinctively, that someone in front of them needs holding. "It's okay, I get sad too sometimes. But then Mama hugs me and it gets smaller." Nathaniel sat frozen, arms hovering uselessly, unsure what to do with the warm, solid weight of a child curled trustingly against him. Nobody had touched him with such simple, unguarded affection in 3 years. Sarah used to hug him exactly like that, no agenda, no pity, just because she loved him. Slowly, carefully, like he might break something fragile, he wrapped his arms around Maya and held her. Rosa stood in the doorway, eyes stinging, watching her daughter do something no doctor, no therapist, no well-meaning friend had managed in 3 years. She was holding a broken man together, one small hug at a time, and she had no idea she was doing it. From that day on, something in the house shifted. Nathaniel started asking after Maya when she wasn't around. He had a little table and chair set delivered for the study, sized just for her, along with a shelf of picture books he'd quietly, personally researched and ordered online. He told himself it was simple kindness toward an employee's kid. He wasn't ready yet to look at the fuller truth, the way his chest now ached with something dangerously close to hope, the way he'd started for the first time in years wanting to get better. But wanting isn't the same as doing. The chair was still a shield, and shields once built that tall don't come down easily. Not even for a little girl with a chewed-up elephant and a smile too big to argue with. To understand why Nathaniel couldn't stand, you have to go back to the rain, and I promise, once you hear what happened that night, everything about this man will make a different kind of sense. It had been raining the night Sarah died. Nothing dramatic, the soft, ordinary kind of rain that barely justifies an umbrella. They were driving home from her sister's baby shower. Sarah laughing about something, one hand resting on her belly, 7 months along with their daughter. Nathaniel remembered the laugh most of all. He remembered thinking in that unremarkable, forgettable moment that he was the luckiest man alive. Then a truck ran a red light. He remembered almost nothing of the impact itself, just fragments. A sound he still heard sometimes in his sleep, the world tilting sideways, and then silence so much worse than any sound could have been. He walked away with a fractured wrist and a mild concussion. Sarah and their daughter did not walk away at all. The guilt settled into him like something toxic. He'd been the one driving, he'd chosen the route home. And in some shattered, irrational corner of his grief, his own legs, the very things that had carried him out of that wreck alive, started to feel like a betrayal. Why should his legs still work when hers never would again? Why should he get to walk through the world when his daughter would never take a single step in it? A specialist, 3 months out from the accident, explained gently that this kind of thing happens sometimes. Trauma could paralyze a body with nothing physically wrong with it, the mind convincing itself it needed punishing or protecting or maybe both at once. With therapy, the doctor said there was every chance he'd walk again. Nathaniel listened, nodded, and quietly decided not to try. It wasn't about ability, it was about whether he deserved to. And some broken part of him had decided, somewhere in the wreckage of that October night, that he didn't deserve to walk through a world that no longer had them in it. For 3 years he let everyone believe he couldn't. It was simpler than explaining he wouldn't. Pity is easier to sit with than judgment. Nobody questions a grieving widower in a wheelchair. Everybody would have questioned a man who could walk and chose not to. Rosa didn't know any of this. She only had fragments picked up from careful staff gossip that Mr. Cole had lost his wife and unborn child in a crash, that the wheelchair showed up sometime after. She assumed, like everyone did, that his legs simply didn't work anymore. But kids, Nathaniel was starting to learn, see things adults train themselves not to. One evening, working later than usual, Rosa realized Maya had wandered off again, this time toward the west wing, where an old nursery sat locked and untouched. Exactly as it had been left 3 years earlier, prepared for a baby who never came home. Rosa hurried after her, heart pounding, dreading whatever memories that room might stir up. She found Maya standing outside the door, not inside it, just staring at a small brass nameplate that had never been taken down. It read in careful engraved script, "Hope's room." "Whose room is that?" Maya asked when her mother caught up, breathless. Rosa had no idea what to say. Behind them, the soft roll of wheels on hardwood announced Nathaniel's approach. He'd heard the small voice from down the hall, and something had pulled him toward it, some instinct he didn't fully understand himself. He stopped a few feet away, looking at a nameplate he hadn't been able to face directly in 3 years. "That was going to be my daughter's room," he said quietly. His voice didn't shake, but it cost him something to keep it steady. Her name was going to be Hope. Rosa's hand flew to her mouth. "Sir, I'm so sorry, we'll go. I didn't mean, it's all right." And to his own surprise, he meant it. Maya, unbothered by the heaviness in the air the way only small children can be, walked over and took his hand in both of hers. "Hope's a pretty name. I bet she would have liked hugs." Like me, something cracked open in Nathaniel's chest, not painfully, more like a window finally letting in air after being sealed shut for years. He hadn't spoken his daughter's name aloud since the funeral. He'd certainly never pictured himself saying it while sitting in front of her empty nursery, holding the hand of another little girl who somehow, impossibly, understood grief without needing it explained to her. "Yeah," he said, voice rough, "I think she would have." That night after Rosa took Maya home, Nathaniel sat alone in the study for a long time, staring at nothing. For the first time in 3 years, he let himself actually cry, not the careful, controlled tears he sometimes allowed himself in private, but real. Ugly sobs that emptied out something old and rotten inside him. He didn't notice at first that his legs had shifted slightly under the desk, an old habit resurfacing, muscle memory quietly reminding him they'd always been capable. Waiting 3 patient years for permission to move again. Now here's the moment that changes everything, the The one nobody in that house saw coming, not even me if I'm honest, the first time I heard how this story really ends. It happened on a Thursday. 3 weeks after the visit to the nursery, Rosa had brought Maya in as usual, settling her at the little table in the study with crayons while she went upstairs to handle the bedrooms. Nathaniel was on a video call in the adjoining office, door cracked, glancing over now and then to check on his small, self-appointed shadow. What none of them planned for was the library next door. 2 stories of shelves, reachable by a rolling ladder Nathaniel hadn't touched in years. Maya wandered in, drawn by a row of picture books on a low shelf, but her eye caught something higher up, a bright, interesting spine. And in the fearless logic that only exists in a 3-year-old's brain, she decided to climb. She was 3 rungs up when the old, improperly locked ladder began to roll. Nathaniel heard the shift in sound before he understood what it meant, a creak, a small startled gasp, and then Maya's frightened cry as the ladder tilted and her grip slipped. He didn't think. He didn't remember in that split second 3 years of careful stillness, 3 years of guilt convincing his body it didn't deserve to move. He saw a falling child and something ancient, something that had nothing to do with permission, overrode everything else. Nathaniel stood up. His legs, weak, unused, atrophied from years of disuse, nearly buckled under him instantly. But adrenaline is a powerful thing, and it turns out grief is no match for a father's instinct, even a buried one. He crossed the room in 3 unsteady, desperate strides and caught Maya just before she hit the hardwood, twisting so his own shoulder took the brunt of the fall instead of her small body. They landed together in a tangle, Maya crying more from fright than pain, Nathaniel gasping, shoulder throbbing. Legs trembling violently beneath him from 3 years of disuse, suddenly asked to perform a miracle. Rosa came running at the sound of the crash and stopped dead in the doorway, staring at something her brain refused to process for a full second. Nathaniel Cole, on the floor, on his own 2 legs. Cradling her sobbing daughter against his chest. You're standing," her voice shook. Nathaniel looked up at her, his own face pale with shock, like his body had just done something without asking his permission. "She's all right," he managed. "She's all right, I caught her, he stopped, staring down at his legs like they belonged to a stranger. "Mama," Maya wailed, and Rosa rushed forward, scooping her daughter up, checking her over frantically, a small scrape on her elbow, nothing more, mostly just fright. "You can walk," Rosa said slowly once she'd confirmed her daughter was safe. It wasn't quite an accusation, but it wasn't entirely without hurt either. "You've been able to walk this whole time." Nathaniel closed his eyes. There was no hiding left, no shield of practiced pity and distance. The truth sat between them now, raw and undeniable. "Yes," he admitted, voice breaking. "I can walk. I've been able to for a long time. I couldn't make myself do it." Not until he looked down at Maya, still gripping a fistful of his shirt, watching him with wide, curious eyes. "Not until I thought she was about to get hurt." Rosa sat back on her heels, holding her daughter close, trying to process 3 years of assumed disability, 3 years of quiet, careful pity for a man who had simply chosen not to stand. She wasn't angry exactly. Grief made people do strange, self-punishing things, she understood that much. But she was shaken and frightened by how close her daughter had come to real injury, and uncertain what any of this meant for her job, her daughter's safety. The fragile stability she'd fought so hard to build. "I think," she said carefully, helping Maya to her feet and inspecting the scrape again, "we need to talk, all of us, but not today. Today I just need to take my daughter home." Nathaniel nodded, still trembling, still sitting on the library floor on legs that hadn't held his weight properly in 3 years. "Rosa," he said as she turned to leave, "thank you for letting her into this house. I know I didn't deserve that." "She gave it to me anyway." Rosa paused in the doorway, Maya's small hand in hers, and looked back at the broken, healing man on the floor. "She has a habit of doing that," she said softly. "Giving people gifts they don't think they deserve." That night, alone in his enormous house, Nathaniel stood at his bedroom window on legs that ached with the strange effort of simply holding him upright, and looked out at the dark garden below. For 3 years he'd been waiting, without even realizing it, for permission to come back to life. He hadn't gotten it from a doctor or a therapist or 3 years of quiet self-punishment. He'd gotten it from a 3-year-old who didn't know grief was supposed to keep his legs from working, and so simply they had. But standing once in an emergency is one thing. What happens next is a whole different kind of hard, and it's the part of this story that made me cry the first time I heard it told. The days after the fall were quiet, careful ones. Rosa didn't come back to work right away. She needed 2 days just to sit with what had happened, to reassure herself Maya really was okay, to decide what any of it meant for her small, fragile family's future. Nathaniel spent those 2 days in physical therapy, arranged urgently and privately, working to rebuild 3 years of atrophied strength in muscles that had apparently been ready this whole time. Every session heard. Every session he thought about a small hand gripping his shirt, about a purple stick figure with a smile too wide to be real. About a girl who'd told him with complete toddler certainty that he'd smile like that too someday. When Rosa finally came back, nervous, Maya in tow, she found Nathaniel waiting in the foyer, standing beneath the very chandelier Maya had once spun under, convinced it held stars. He wasn't perfectly steady, he leaned slightly on a cane his therapist had recommended for these early weeks, but he was standing there on his own two legs waiting for them. Maya, he said, and something in his voice, warm, open, nothing like the man he'd been 3 years running, made Rosa's breath catch in her throat. Maya broke free from her mother's hand and ran straight at him. Nathaniel, still unsteady, still relearning a body long out of practice, knelt carefully to catch her. Laughing, actually laughing, as she collided into him with all the enthusiastic force a 3-year-old could muster. "You're standing," she said, delighted, like this was the best surprise anyone had ever handed her. "I told you you'd smile like that, you told me." He held her close, throat tight with something he no longer bothered hiding. "You were right." Rosa stood back, watching tears slipping down her cheeks despite herself. She was holding on to relief and wonder, and underneath all of it, a cautious, growing hope she hadn't let herself feel in a very long time. Nathaniel looked up at her over Maya's dark curls. "I owe you an explanation, a real one, and an apology for letting you believe something that wasn't true, even if I didn't fully understand why myself. Not until recently." Over tea in the sunroom that afternoon, while Maya napped on the nearby couch, worn out from her own joy, Nathaniel told Rosa everything. About Sarah, about hope. About the guilt that convinced his body it didn't deserve to carry him through a world his wife and daughter would never get to see. About 3 years of practice paralysis, easier to live inside than the raw, unbearable truth underneath it. "I'm not proud of it," he admitted, "deceiving everyone, deceiving myself. I didn't know how to stop, not until your daughter started asking questions nobody else dared to ask. Not until she decided, for reasons I still don't fully understand, that I was worth loving anyway." Rosa listened, and when he finished, she reached across the small table and covered his hand with hers, a simple human gesture between two people who both knew what it was to lose something they couldn't get back. "Grief does strange things to people," she said gently. "I'm not going to pretend I'm not still shaken by what almost happened to her. That scared me more than I can say. But I've watched my daughter fall for you these past weeks, in that uncomplicated way kids love people, and I've watched you turn into someone softer because of her. I don't think that's something you need to apologize for. I think it might be something to be grateful for, and if you think that's where the story ends, stick around, because what happened over the next year is the part that actually earns the ending." In the months that followed, Nathaniel's recovery kept moving, slow and steady. Each week bringing a little more strength back into legs that had spent 3 years waiting to be trusted again. He returned, carefully, to parts of his life he'd abandoned entirely. He visited Sarah and Hope's graves for the first time since the funeral, standing at the headstone on his own 2 feet, and told them quietly about a little girl with a chewed-up elephant who'd taught him how to come back from the dead. Rosa kept her job, though the shape of the household shifted in ways neither of them had fully expected. Maya became a permanent, joyful fixture in the mansion, no longer confined to the kitchen or the staff sitting room, welcomed everywhere now. Her laughter finally allowed to echo through halls that had gone quiet for far too long. And slowly, carefully, something grew between Nathaniel and Rosa too, not rushed, not forced, but built patiently out of shared grief, mutual respect, and the strange glowing thread a small child had stitched between them without ever meaning to. One evening, almost a year after Maya first spun beneath that chandelier believing it held actual stars, Nathaniel stood in the same foyer, steady now on his own 2 legs, watching Rosa help her daughter out of her coat after a day at preschool. The little girl, 4 now, spotted him and came running, exactly like she always did. And exactly like he always did, Nathaniel knelt to catch her. "Guess what?" Maya announced, breathless with the very important business of being 4. "I drew you again, but this time you're not sitting down. You're standing up, and you're holding my hand and Mama's hand too." She held up the drawing, 3 purple stick figures standing together under a bright yellow sun. All 3 of them smiling too wide to be believable. Nathaniel looked at the drawing, then at Rosa, watching him with soft, hopeful eyes, and felt his own wide, impossible smile spread across his face, the exact one a determined 3-year-old had promised him a long time ago that he'd wear someday. "It's perfect," he said, voice thick. "It's exactly right. and for the first time in 3 years, standing tall in the golden evening light of a house that had finally actually become a home Nathaniel Cole believed completely. Without reservation that it was. So here's what I keep coming back to with this one. A man can build every wall money can buy, and it still only takes one small, stubborn hand to knock the first brick loose. If you were in Nathaniel's position, 3 years into grief you'd convinced yourself you had to carry alone, what do you think would have reached you? A doctor's advice, time. Or something as simple and unplanned as a kid who refuses to see you the way you see yourself. Let me know where you're watching from tonight, and if this one got to you the way it got to me while I was putting it together, hit like, subscribe if you're new here. And drop your thoughts down in the comments. I read every single one,